Good evening, everyone. You're listening to Red Pill 78. I am the Corruption Detector, and this is your Red Pill News. This is a very special presentation. My guest tonight is David Paulides, author and researcher. He has written a series of books called Missing 411. It deals with a series of cases of strange disappearances of people from national parks and other remote areas. David has been hard at work at this for many, many years, and his background as a police officer uniquely placed him to be able to really get to the bottom of what's going on. Now, please join me in welcoming my guest to the show, David Paulides. First of all, a big thank you to Vikings War of Clans for sponsoring this video. The dev team there wanted me to try out the game. I figured, hey, it's free, why not? But after 5 minutes, I was hooked. So Vikings War of Clans was inspired by the famous strategy and RPG games of the 90s. Today, all the games are about running and hiding and shooting, but Vikings gives you a deep strategic experience. If you're looking for a game that combines strategy, team play, and where time invested will pay off with victories, this game is for you. It's got a great visual style, it's packed with excellent 3D graphics and a gorgeous presentation, plus a really immersive soundtrack. You start out in the role of Jarl, the leader of your own kingdom. You begin by building your town, searching the area for resources, and then building up your army. And another thing I really like about this game is that it's not a real-time shooter where you blink and then bam, you're dead for the match. I can play for 5 minutes or 5 hours and pick it up when I feel like it. But basically you can choose your own styles. Some players like to explore, some focus on building their cities, some others like researching technologies, but all of them can discover a mythical world. My favorite part is the deep character and strategy progression. The more you play, the more you build up your character, and the more you can do. Help support my channel by downloading Vikings for free, only from my link in the description box, and get the special bonus of 200 gold coins and a protective shield. Don't forget to look me up and join my Vikings clan under the nickname Wolfsbane78. So, joining me today is a good friend of the program, David Paulides. David is an author, researcher, and so much more. Dave, thank you for being here on the show with us today.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So, Dave, you are author of the Missing 411 book series, and I know that you're a former police officer. Can you tell us just how did you get into this research?
So, about 8 years ago, maybe 9 years ago now, I was in a national park doing some peripheral work and background on another topic, and I saw a couple of national park rangers following me around. And which isn't unusual. And when I'm in the park, I'm usually never talking to the official people. I'm always talking to the workers and things that are contractors in the park because they'll talk. At the end of the day, one of these park rangers knocked on the door and he said, "Hey, Dave, we were following you. We kind of knew who you were, and my partner and I wanted to talk to you about something." I said, "Sure." And initially it was just one. Then later on another guy came and they said they had worked at a series of parks and that they had seen disappearances happen from these various areas. And initially there was a lot of publicity, a lot of effort to find the people, and then after 7 to 10 days there was almost nothing. And they thought it was strange, and then they tried to find some information about the cases, and they were thwarted in their attempts, which they thought was even more strange. And then as time went on, they saw that people were disappearing in areas that they thought themselves didn't make sense. And what I mean by that is that, you know, if somebody disappears far back in the backcountry and you never find them, you know, you kind of understand that, I guess. But when people disappear in the valley floor where there shouldn't be any disappearances because there's a lot of people and a lot of witnesses, they thought it was odd. And so they said somebody ought to look into it. So the next day I was leaving the park, I called some law enforcement friends and explained to them what I heard. And I said, "Hey, could you run and see if there's any disappearances or there's a number of them in national parks?" They came back a couple hours later and said, "Oh my God, yeah, there's a lot, and there doesn't seem to be much going on there as far as publicity or effort to find these people, because after a short period of time, all the information about it kind of dries up." I said, "Okay." So from that, I came back and I filed a series of Freedom of Information Acts against the National Park Service Police requesting a list of missing people from their jurisdiction. And many people don't know this, but the National Park Service Police a large contingent of federally trained law enforcement people, very highly trained, better trained than most police departments. And the common place to start would be to get the list and do the research from the list. And after I filed that, several months later, I get a call from an attorney from the National Park Service asking me why I wanted that list. And this doesn't make much sense because, according to the Freedom of Information Act, why a person asks for any information from the government is irrelevant and can't be used against them about why the government will give up that information. And I told him that. And the attorney said, no. We're not here to decide if you're going to get the information or not. We just want to know why you want it. I still thought that was odd. But I said, oh, okay, well, I just want it for research. And this person said, well, we don't have any lists of missing people. And as somebody who knows what's politically correct in the world and what's not, and knowing that you or anybody else could go into any small and medium-sized police department in the U.S. and ask that police chief for a list of missing persons in their jurisdiction, within an hour, they would have a list of missing people. And so initially I thought, oh, this is really odd. And he said, no, we don't have any lists and blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, well, maybe it's a semantics issue because I just couldn't believe it. The National Park Service Police would have a list of missing people from each of their parks and monuments. So we refiled again, and this time it came back again. Same attorney calls me and says, no, we understood your first request. We don't keep track of these missing people. And again, I didn't believe it. I still don't believe it. So I talked to a series of professional journalists, and nobody believed it. And in fact, George Knapp, who's the chief investigative journalist for CBS in Las Vegas, he said on the air, they're lying. They have a list. They don't want to give it up for some reason. And I suppose that's what started it all, and that's how we got on the move to say, well, if they won't give us a list, we'll just do the hardcore research, go through the archives, and find out as best we can how many people are missing.
And about how many people have you identified as being part of this missing 411 phenomenon?
So since we started on national parks, then we kind of jetted off into federal government land, BIA land, U.S. Forest Service land, and then we have more cases from even private property. But in total, there's almost 1,100 cases.
Wow. Right. So so this is basically just like a phenomena in remote areas, essentially.
So I've written 7 books about missing people in fairly remote areas. And I've written one book called Missing 411: A Sobering Coincidence, which fits the profile points we established, but it's about predominantly young men who disappear from sometimes an urban area, and they're found in a body of water. It could be a pond, a lake, a river. Most times the coroners will come back, will say, well, they drowned, but there's no way to figure out how they got from point to point. Nobody ever sees them enter the water. And on a large number of those cases, they can't figure out why the person died. So that's the one caveat to the missing cases that people kind of don't understand, is that there is that one book that's a big seller because there's a lot of these cases out there.
Yeah, that's a lot. It's crazy. I mean, overall, what is it that kind of classifies a case as part of this missing 411 phenomenon? There's a set of data points?
So if you look at 3 or 4 missing cases, it's not going to really jump out at you that they're going to be different. If you look at 100, well, after about 200 or 300 cases, I started to put stacks in my living room that had these common points to them. And right away, what struck me is I used to be on a SWAT team when I was a policeman, and we had the canine unit attached to us, which was 20 dogs. And we always would go out with them and search for bad guys, and they went with us on bad entries and things like that. And I was around these dogs all the time, and they were the most eager group of canines I've ever seen to go work. They all wanted to get out there and help. But the dogs that I read about in a lot of these cases, they'd be taken to the point where the person was last seen, and sometimes they'd walk in a circle and lay down. Sometimes they'd walk down the trail and just lay down. Sometimes they were completely uninterested or afraid. It was hard to determine what. But one of the most common profile points is canines can't pick up a scent or won't track. And that is not normal, especially when you have, say, a family saying, hey, this is the point where my daughter was last with us, right here. So you have a credible location, a credible place to start, and you bring the dogs there and they can't find a scent. Something's really weird. But this has happened in hundreds of cases. So in these cases, we've seen these points where we start to say, okay, that's profile point number one. Number two is there appears to be a weather event in conjunction with the disappearance, meaning that after the person disappears, it either starts to rain or snow or something to encumber the search, or as the person's disappearing, there's some kind of event that will encumber the search, or there's something that restricts search and rescue efforts that's related to weather. That's another one. Another big one is that we have two ends of the intellectual spectrum. We have people with disabilities or with inherited type of complexities to their thinking process. We have Alzheimer's, autism, things like that. And then on the other end, we have people that are super high intellectuals, like physicists, who have disappeared. And both ends of the spectrum are represented in a large way. There's also a genetic anomaly in that it appears that people with German descent disappear more than all others. And then boulders come into play in granite. A lot of people disappear around boulders and granite, or are either found in boulders or around boulders and granite. And then water comes into play too, just like I stated earlier. But those are the most common ones right there.
You know, it's interesting learning that there is this spectrum of people with some type of interesting disorder or something wrong with them. Going from perhaps, maybe slightly handicapped to genius level. These are like people that, would make an interesting study. That's like the first thing that I thought when I heard you saying that before.
Well, as you get into it, that's one train of thought. But then the other thing is that I was giving a presentation at a conference the other day, and we were on the same track of thinking. And I made a presentation about all of the physicists that have disappeared and haven't been found. And I said, in all of the work I've done, I've never found anything but a German physicist that disappeared.
Oh, wow.
How odd is that?
That's extremely odd.
Yeah.
Now, when you're thinking of all of the cases, the number of cases that you've looked into, how many of them have like some level, of that interesting aspect? I mean, is it pretty much all of them, or is it just greater than half?
Oh no, it's a subgroup of that larger number, but it's a number that makes you take note.
Statistically
as far
significant.
As the actual breakdown, I've never sat down and actually done it, but it's more than anybody else.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Now the other cool thing about this here is that you've gone from this many books that you've written, and now you've got it available in two different film presentations. Do you have any plans on making additional films?
We've been asked to do a third one, and nothing's in production yet, and we're still kind of talking about it, but we'll see. I mean, films are a lot different than books. I mean, I can sit down and pound out a book in 3 or 4 months. Movies take a couple years.
Really? And
they're complex and they're super expensive. So unless we've got a real good storyline that we can all agree on, probably not going to do it. If we come up with something that's viable and understandable and we think people will like it, yeah, we'll do it. The most common comment I've had about our movies is people will say that, well, I saw the movie and it was good, but how come you didn't cover more cases? And I think people don't understand that in a documentary you have between maybe 90 and 120 minutes. That's
right.
The standard length. And if I just pound in a ton of cases, yeah, you're going to get a real brief overview of a few, maybe 10 people, but you're not going to know the intimate details that make that case interesting or the intimate details behind that person's life that led up to the disappearance, which really makes for a compelling story. If I just throw a bunch of names at you and a bunch of profile points, hey, so what? I mean, I think you want to know the story behind the story, and that's kind of the method that we're taking. So I think in the way we do it, if we're going to do it again, you're probably never going to get more than 4 or 5 cases at a time, because after that, it just gets diluted so much it's worthless.
I tend to agree. I mean, I think you guys did a great job on both of the movies. I think that the premise and the setup, having, you know, 2 distinctly different subsets of people that you're talking about in each of the films. I think the third film would be great if you did those people found in urban areas, the people drowning. I think that that's extremely fascinating because from the information that I've learned, you know, just about those cases, I mean, I'd be personally interested in it. But oh, how many clusters of missing people are we talking about here throughout North America?
There's 60.
60. Okay, and those range from national parks just to other government lands. How many of them are on private land?
You know, again, a point I've never really counted and delineated that, but there's clusters going all the way through the Sierra Nevada mountains in western U.S., up through the Cascades, around the top, up through Oregon, California, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Colorado. There's a big gap in disappearances in the middle of Nevada, and there's a big gap of disappearances right down the middle of the U.S. north to south, then going back up the Appalachian Trail along the eastern U.S., going north up through Maine, and then again, they completely encircle the Great Lakes. So in distances, if you really work it down, I think we've figured out that 80% of the clusters are within 250 miles of a major body of water, meaning the Pacific, the Atlantic, or the Great Lakes.
That's pretty interesting for me because I'm from Michigan, knowing that.
There's a lot of disappearances in Michigan, strange things.
Wow. Now, are there any like national parks that do not have clusters of missing people?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay. All right, so overwhelmingly, it's more safe than not being safe.
Well, I tell people all the time, I go to national parks every chance I get.
Yeah.
I mean, I never will tell somebody not to go in there, but to do it safely. And the biggest message I ever have is when you're hiking on a trail, carry a personal locator beacon, go with somebody if you can. If you can't, tell somebody where you're going and make sure you come back and tell them when you're out safe. But always carry a personal locator beacon. They cost about $200 on Amazon, and they're well worth it.
Have you ever seen a case where someone went missing and they were carrying a personal locator beacon?
I know of 2.
Okay.
But so the other part of what you should carry, I never go anywhere without. I mean, I'm a policeman. I was trained. I was on a SWAT team, so I'm 100% comfortable carrying a gun all the time. Mm-hmm. I don't know of one case where somebody was carrying a personal locator beacon and a gun. Now, one of my books is about nothing but people that carried guns, and those are missing hunters. Mm-hmm. Now, none of those people that I wrote about were carrying a personal locator beacon, which is odd. I think most hunters should by now be cognizant that you should be carrying one, especially since they're a group that's off trail a lot. So I pass that message along all the time.
All right. Wise words. Wise words. I know in the films you do go over a checklist, basically, of things that you should do if you are going to be traveling in these areas. So pay attention. You guys definitely need to see the movies. We're going to have a couple of links for people to go and purchase the movies where they can watch them in the description of this video after we're done. Now, in Missing 411, the first movie, you're talking about children that have gone missing. There was a little boy in Idaho who disappeared, who was camping with his parents, and then he was never found, which is just absolutely insane to me, to think that he could go missing in such a remote area and there's no trace of him to be found. What happened in that case?
So first of all, let me preface that there's dozens and dozens of these cases in my books. This case is not unique. But we put it on the film because it was happening just as it was the closure and the initial investigation was just happening as we were filming, so we went with it. Now, in that incident, there was a husband and a wife, a grandpa, and a friend of the grandpa that were all camping together at this remote location. Now, the husband and wife were coming back from this creek with the little boy, 2 years old, and he says, "Hey, I want to go with Grandpa." And they go, "Okay." So they can see Grandpa, they can see the boy walking to Grandpa, and the other man is down by the creek, kind of near where they were, and the parents turn around and go back to the creek. Well, somehow or another, the boy disappears between that and the point he was supposed to be at the grandpa. Now, the parents all say the grandpa didn't go anywhere, Grandpa's somewhat disabled. The other guy that was with Grandpa was nowhere nearby. The boy disappears. They bring in canines. They can't pick up a scent, even though the boy was there and everyone says he was there, but they can't pick up a scent. And massive search. They've got nothing. And this was years ago now. It's almost 3 years ago. They still have nothing. And there's been a lot of nasty things stated about the parents on this case. And what I can tell you is that you can say a lot of nasty things about a lot of people. And in extreme conflict and in extreme anxiety and stress, people do a lot of strange things. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not an advocate for the parents or against the parents, but I will say that in my time in law enforcement and in my time dealing with missing people, I've seen relatives of missing people do very odd things. Now, our feeling, everybody on the crew that covered this case and was around these people, our feeling is either everybody at that scene had to be involved at some level, or nobody was involved. Because when you dissect their story, they either all know and are all protecting each other, or none of them know, and it's just like they said. And when you think that the husband and the wife that are the victims of this missing child have since divorced, and nobody's come over and pointed fingers at each other saying, yeah, you killed him or they killed him, none of that has happened. Mm. And you would think by now, if there was a hole in the story, somebody would have come forward. And as of right now, nobody has.
Yeah, I thought it was really sad the way that they were being treated by people there locally. And when you guys were filming, people walked by and said some stuff about them. You know, nobody knows how they're going to act in a situation like that. You know, grief manifests itself in very, different ways in every single person. You know, in your experience as a law enforcement officer, I wanted to ask you this earlier and I forgot, but have you ever been in a situation or seen any other law enforcement agency that was not interested in tracking something like this? I mean, isn't missing people a pretty serious thing for everyone?
So I've got to say that missing children are handled probably the majority of the time by law enforcement quite different than missing adults. A lot of times, missing adults, law enforcement will take the case and they'll find out years later, hey, the person disappeared and they didn't want anything to do with their family and they just want to drop out of society. That's not a crime. Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong with it, and you can do that. And it's very frustrating if you've devoted thousands of hours to trying to find the person to figure out that's what happened. When it'd be really nice if they just dropped a dime on the law enforcement person and said, hey, I'm okay, just don't tell my family. You don't have to investigate me. I just don't want to talk to anyone. Mm-hmm. Okay, fine, That's great. We'll do it. But to not call them and not do anything, it gets really frustrating when this happens to law enforcement people multiple times in a career. It's a colossal waste of time. Now, small children, different ballgame. I was one of the investigators that was called out on the Poly class case out of Petaluma, California. And I can tell you that the FBI team that worked that and the other law enforcement people that were called in on that case, there was nothing more important in our lives when that case was going on than finding her. And I mean, everybody there gave 150% of their life to that case. Because I think all of us that had family looked at that little girl or look at that little boy and say, hey, that could have been us. Yeah. You got to do everything you can. Put yourself in that family's position and think, my God, somebody's got to help them.
So knowing that, what logical reason can you ascribe to the National Park Service, or was the Department of the Interior, not caring about keeping up with lists of people going missing in national parks? What logical reason is there for an agency to not be following up on this stuff?
There's none. Yeah. There is absolutely none. I mean, if you think about what the National Park Police is supposed to be doing is protecting us. Mm-hmm. And if they are withholding data that points to an issue, then they sure as heck aren't protecting us. And they're putting us into harm's way. Now, I've heard all kinds of theories from different people over the years. about why they may or may not be doing it, and none of it's good. One is that they're aware that there's an abnormal number of missing people and they don't want the public to know. There may be a cause out there that they can't control, and anything our government can't control, they won't acknowledge. They don't want to acknowledge. So those are probably two of the best I've heard.
I guess that makes sense. Just ignore it and it'll go away. Now, how do we know that, in these remote places, how do we know that people are not just being dragged off by animals, by wild animals? Since it's so remote, that seems like the most logical explanation that I can think of, especially like a little kid. People
Absolutely.
Yeah,
sure. So when a search and rescue team goes out and looks for somebody, they're going through a vetting process in their mind about what's happened. So one of the things that everyone's trained with search and rescue is to look for animal predation. So drag marks, blood, torn clothing. If somebody gets attacked by something, there's going to be screams. There's going to be tissue and blood and clothes and drag marks and torn up trails and torn up foliage in the area. It's going to be pretty obvious real quick that something major happened. And I encourage your listeners to go online and Google animal predation and then look at the photos. And I mean, anybody with a third grade education is going to be able to tell pretty quickly that somebody's been attacked. Now, that's the first vetting point we have in our research. Any evidence of animal predation, we won't take the case. Any evidence of criminal acts in conjunction with the disappearance, we won't take the case. Any evidence of mental illness, meaning the person mentally unstable, etc., wanted to maybe harm themselves, we won't take the case. We go through this vetting process, so we exclude all of those cases where your mind will quickly go to try to acknowledge, it's not really a serious case. This is really what happened. No, that's already been all vetted out.
All right. Well, there was a case of a little boy. His family, they owned a store. I believe he went missing, and then sometime later the remains were found. And in the movie, several people say that they ascribe it to animal attacks. But his father, he said that wasn't the case. And was that because all of those signs and symptoms were missing? He wasn't torn up. There wasn't the signs of an animal.
So probably the case, this is one case I know the best out of anything. And his dad actually owned a resort up in the mountains.
Yes.
And this little boy went off with a group of singles that were staying at the resort. And the single people lost track of the little boy on a trail. He was seen by some fishermen on the trail next to the river, kind of hitting a stick in the water. And the fisherman got mad at him. That was the last person that ever saw him. 4 years later, his remains are found 550 feet up this mountainside from the river. And my son and I went up there, and there's a YouTube video that we made of it that's on our site. If you Google Can-Am Missing Project on Google or on YouTube, you can see the video. And we had to get on our hands and knees. That's how steep it is going up the side of this mountain to where he was found. And the only thing they found 4 years later was his skull cap, one tooth. They found his pants inside out, and they found his sweatshirt and both shoes. Now, his dad and I are really good friends now because I was the only guy that really was with him and figured most of this stuff out. First of all, the shoes look as though that they haven't been in 4 heavy winters and summers at 9,000 feet. Animals don't turn pants inside out. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation took the clothing from this case, and they didn't find 1 ounce of blood on anything. And the biggest thing is that the county sheriff's department immediately had a press conference and said, well, it's obvious that a mountain lion killed this boy. And the dad told me, Dave, do you know my little boy never, ever, ever let me tie his shoes, and he always walked around with them kind of flopping on his feet. And he said, now, if a mountain lion drug my boy up 550 feet up a mountainside, what are the chances those shoes would have been on? I said, about 0. And he goes, that's right. And he said, now, if a mountain lion attacked my boy, all the mountain lion people, and he said he spoke to 4 of them, all said that a mountain lion didn't kill his boy because they would go right through that clothing and just tear it to shreds, getting to him to eat him. And the mountain lion experts, all 4 were unanimous and said a mountain lion didn't kill your boy. Now, the most unusual things, and I told his dad when I saw it, because they had crime scene photos that I obtained, and I showed him a picture of the skull of his boy. And I said, you see these striation marks on the skull? I said, I've never seen anything like this. And there were striation marks on the skull that made right-hand turns that were completely 90-degree angles. And I gave them to Harvey Pratt, who was the number 2 man in the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation. And I asked him to give it to them, his forensic examiner, that at the time was 75 years old and studied 5,000 cases. This guy came back and said, in all my years, in 5,000 cases, I've never seen a skull like that.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was my next question, is how was the skull cap removed from the rest of the skull? And then where did the lower half of the skull go? Do you happen to have pictures of that? Did you include that in any of your books?
It's in the presentations I make, but it's not in the books.
Okay, all right. Well, hopefully next time you're doing a presentation, I can be there, because I'd be very interested to see what those look like. That's terrible. That's so sad. Well, in Missing 411: The Hunted, you exclusively talk about hunters that go missing. I mean, what's so disturbing about the idea of hunters going missing?
So number one, they're armed. And that is a point that most people who don't hunt don't understand, because you have a device in your hands that can signal for help for miles away. And in hunter safety classes, and experienced hunters know that if you're lost, you fire off 3 rounds in rapid succession and you sit still. And in another hour, you fire off 3 more rounds. And eventually people will find you. Now, also, hunters usually hunt grounds that they've hunted for many years. And many of the stories I wrote about in Missing 411 Hunters dealt with people who disappeared on hunting land that had been in their family for generations. And the relatives said that that person, my uncle, my dad, whatever, disappearing on that land is as ridiculous as you disappearing in your backyard. He knew that land like you know your backyard. And then there were other instances where the hunters were very old, very nimble, couldn't travel long distances, and they were just placed in an area to hunt, and they were going to feed or kind of shoo the animals their way so they didn't have to get up and walk long distance. It's those kind of stories that you start to think about. It doesn't make any sense at all.
No, there was one case in particular where an older gentleman who had, as a disability, he had his missing eye, had left missing eye, was it? And he just completely disappeared. His pack was gone, his gun was gone, all of his possessions were gone, and he was only alone for something like 2 hours, right?
Correct. And some of the flack I've read online with this is ridiculous. They said, well, Politis is saying these things online, and, this really isn't true. Well, it's these people that haven't watched the movie that people read this stuff online and they believe it's true. Folks, my words play a very small role in this movie. It's the law enforcement people that actually did the work that are interviewed that make the statements online that you ought to be paying attention to. And in that case, his son, who was there, we interviewed one of the search and rescue commanders that's now the head of one of the sheriff's departments up there, was interviewed, and he talked about it, and he said how strange it was. No, it's just like you said. A lot of times they say, well, it's something we just can't explain. It makes no sense at all. And probably one of the more interesting parts of that story was when I was interviewing the search and rescue commander, I said, how many animals did you guys see in there when you were searching? He goes, oh, it was kind of odd. We didn't see any at all. Now, you think about that. How many times can you go into the deep wilderness and not see any animals at all when you're supposed to be in a ground with a lot of deer? That's weird.
It's very, very weird. The deer just got spooked, perhaps.
And then another part of that story was this older man was hunting with a couple of other friends. It's some guys who owned a hunting lodge up in the mountains, and they were hunting this new ground. And one of these old guys, he was kind of reluctant to say it at the beginning. He said, Dave, he goes, when we were all there, I heard something really weird. And I said, what do you mean? And he goes, something weird. And I said, well, have you heard it before? Nope. 50 years of hunting, I never heard this. And then he goes on to describe the sound that he heard, and it just happened to be during that 2-hour time that this guy went missing. So in hindsight, I got to say, well, you'd be a fool not to think there was some relationship between the sound and this guy disappearing.
Exactly, a correlation. Very strange. Now, another thing that I thought was interesting about that case was that the FBI actually got involved. And as you said earlier, the FBI oftentimes get involved in cases of missing children, but not particularly often when it comes to missing adults, and maybe even less so when it's missing old people.
So the FBI has protocol on when they'll do something and when they won't. And in their protocol, it says that they will get involved in the disappearance of a child under specific circumstances. Now, that's not criminal. They just say that they can get involved in a missing person case involving a child. There is no protocol acceptance for getting involved on a missing person adult. Now, in this case in New York, all of a sudden, they're in the middle of nowhere in New York, and 2 FBI agents show up. And they said, we're just here to monitor the case. And so I asked this commander, I said, did you guys call him? No. Do you know who called him? No. Do you know why they were there? Well, we thought maybe they were going to bring some things that were going to help, but honestly, I have no idea why it was there or why they were there. I said, has the FBI ever shown up on a missing person search before? Nope. So then we interviewed the wife, and the wife said that at the end of the search, these FBI agents came up and said, well, we don't know why your husband disappeared, but something very unusual happened, and he's now entered in this computer system as a missing person, and they left.
Wow.
Now, in the mid-1950s, there were a series of disappearances in the Great Smoky Mountains area of Tennessee. And I wrote that, very unusual, these small kids were disappearing, and these FBI agents were showing up, and they weren't doing anything. They were just monitoring the case, just like these other agents were. Now, for the public who doesn't understand, what that really means is that they're up there documenting what they can learn, and they're sending those reports to their profilers. Profilers back in Virginia read these reports, and they try to find commonalities between other disappearances and things so that they can group them together, very similar to what I'm doing with these clusters. Now, I think the FBI has known since the 50s that something really strange is going on. They won't admit it, they won't talk about it, but they're interested, and that's why they're there. There's no other reason to be up there in the middle of nowhere looking or listening to an old man's disappearance story.
How long was it that this gentleman was missing before the FBI showed up unannounced?
I can't be sure, but I don't think it was more than a couple days.
All right, so that's very, very strange, and it does make one think that the FBI is certainly interested in tracking these things. If they're just going to show up, I mean, I'm sure that people go missing all the time, but what makes it important enough for the FBI to show up? Because there's other factors involved. You said that the FBI won't talk about it, but do you have any contacts at the FBI? Have you attempted to reach out and try to work with anyone in the FBI on this stuff?
So, as a matter of fact, when I was a policeman, my old partner left the police department, went to the FBI, and became the FBI agent in charge for one of the bigger jurisdictions in the United States. We've talked about this stuff. And FBI agents are as different as normal people. Sometimes they'll help, sometimes they won't. But the vast majority of the FBI won't say crap to anybody. And even another law enforcement person. There were times when I was working as a policeman and the FBI was questioning me about something, a crime that we covered or a suspect I arrested, and I'd be talking to them, and then I'd ask them a question, and they'd say, we can't say anything. So then I'd come back and say, okay, well, I'm done talking to you. It's not a two-way street. Okay. It's normally they'll listen and you talk and that's it. So, and when you try to do the same thing, the Freedom of Information Act against the FBI, 99% of the time you get a document that's 90% redacted and you get nothing.
Not particularly useful.
No.
Have you done any searches through like previously released document dumps to see if there's anything that correlates with your research on this stuff, like the blackvault.com or anything like that?
Oh, John Greenwald and I are really good friends. We've done conferences together and talked about this incessantly. No, there's nothing right now that points to really any of the research that we've done, but he knows what we're looking for, and he's always looking too.
All right. How about any other intelligence agencies in the United States? Have you attempted to do FOIA requests there just to see if anything popped up?
Well, I'd have to understand why I was doing the FOIA request and what I was looking for, but as of right now, I have done others, and John has done some for me, I will say that.
Okay.
But because he may have a little more success than I do because people may know what I'm looking for. But, yeah, we've done some others.
All right. Excellent. Well, I look forward to seeing that in the future. Now, there was another case of in the Hunted. A gentleman, I believe it was in Montana. He went missing, separated from his party, and was walking back to a cache spot because maybe he lost some supplies or something like that. And his belongings were found sometime later within sight distance of a local ranch, and there was like a road going back to civilization. But what was weird is that the officer that you were speaking with, he said that the remains were partially buried. Now, it must have been some time later, like I believe it was a year later. Is that correct? That he was found? Actually,
it was a couple years later.
Years. Okay.
Initially, they came back and they found his backpack, his bow, and some other things.
Yeah.
And they did a search, and they didn't find him. Then a year later, some people are riding horseback, and they see a skull laying on the ground. And they came back and they searched, and they found some of his remains. And when he said partially buried, that maybe wasn't the best term. But, with fall and things, it might appear it's buried, but really it's just under debris.
Okay. Okay. That's what I was thinking. All right.
Yeah, that's more really what happened. But when you look at that case, we put the sheriff in a helicopter, and he was in charge of the search and rescue on that case, and kind of his narrative about the distance this guy covered without boots is a phenomenal story, if you can believe it. I mean, the sheriff was 100% credible, but how this guy got from point to point without his boots, that's the bizarre story.
And this is another aspect of these cases that are kind of in common. You'll have people oftentimes not wearing shoes, not wearing boots, and they will be many, many miles from where they were originally last seen. The children, this guy, he was, 9 miles away from where he was supposed to be in the opposite direction. Is there any explanation for how these people are able to travel such distance, and especially in such rugged terrain?
So in that case, they've also brought in canines. And the search and rescue team is coming up the trail in 2 feet of fresh snow. They see no tracks going out. The canines don't pick up any scent. And at the point where they found his boots up in the mountains, he would have had to have crossed the shale field that the sheriff and others described as like walking through glass. No one's going to make it without absolutely ripping up their feet. So would he have done that? I don't think so. But there was no tracks going out, and there was no scent trail going out. So that makes it very hard to understand how he got point to point.
Yeah, the fact that there's no scent trail, it's almost as if people just dematerialized and then rematerialized whatever their final destination is. Now, this isn't something that you spoke about in the movies, but this is something I had heard you talking about before. There's been at least one case that you've studied in these books where people were able to make contact, like once they had gone missing, like people calling for help, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the case specifically, but there was a guy who said that he was lost and he was trying to find his way back and he was confused. Do you remember the case that I'm talking about?
I think that I'll make an attempt at it. In January of this year, I made a 2-hour special for the History Channel, and it's called Vanished. You can watch it on Amazon for like $2, I think.
Okay.
And one of the stories in there was about a man who disappeared at Mesa Verde National Park. And he disappears, and there's a giant search. They don't find anything. His name was Dale Staling. And one of these days, like the second, third, maybe fourth day of the search, a reporter from a local newspaper happened to have an appointment to meet the superintendent. And it wasn't in relationship to the search. It just happened to be that day. So she comes in, and the superintendent goes, "Hey, we're really busy. Can you come back in like 3 hours?" She goes, "Sure." So she decides she's just going to go out and hike the trail and get in the views. And she didn't know it, but she was hiking the trail that Dale disappeared on. And that day, they were giving the dogs and people a break, so there really wasn't a lot of people on the trail. So she's out there, and she says that she hears this voice of this man saying, "Hey, help, help, over here, I need help." And she goes, it freaked her out. She goes, it was distinct, it was a man, he needed help, I know where it was, I looked through the area for like a long time, I saw nothing, and then she came directly back to the superintendent's office, and the chief park ranger and the superintendent were standing together. She said she walked in and told them what she heard. Now, she didn't even know anyone was disappeared in the previous 3 or 4 days. She didn't know there was a search because they hadn't publicized it yet. So she goes and tells them. And she said that the face of those two guys was stunned. And they looked at each other, then looked at her and said, "Well, there's a man who disappeared. And at the exact point where you said that you heard this, some other people heard this a couple days ago. And that area's already been searched 2 or 3 times." And he goes, "We'll go back out there again." So they brought, 15 or 20 people and a couple dogs and went back and searched it again. Same result, found nothing.
That's really spooky. That's just absolutely crazy. I think
now let me preface something.
Yeah.
So we made that special. We've got this reporter on tape, on film. We did the whole thing. We go back to post-production, and the head of Prometheus, Kevin Burns, says, "No, you can't put that segment in there."
What?
So the producer and myself are sitting there saying, no, that's got to go in there. That's a critical part of this segment. He goes, "Oh, no, it makes the Park Service look bad, and we don't want to do that, so we're not putting it in." And the producer and I looked at each other and go, "That's crazy, because this is one of the best parts of the whole movie."
Yeah.
And Kevin said, "Nope, it's not going in." But I guarantee it's a fact what I just told you happened, because this woman did write about it in her newspaper because she was so shocked to hear it.
I'm just absolutely flabbergasted that they wouldn't want that to go in. How does that make the Park Service look bad? We've already got over 1,000 people going missing in the Park Service, and they don't want to keep a track of a list of people. That looks a lot worse to me in my book. Well,
I told them, I said, well, they'd already searched that area twice. That doesn't mean that they're being inefficient or neglectful. And in every one of my books, I always state, first of all, search and rescue, 95% of all search and rescue is done by volunteers. People just like you and me who have an interest, spend their own money and their own time getting certified as a search and rescue professional that can go out and search under these conditions by supervision. These people do a great job, and they do it for free. So I am never going to say anything bad about those people. They're outstanding individuals. They're doing the best they can. Do I think they missed Dale? No. The reason why? Canines missed him too. So how could the canines miss that and 20, 40, 50 people miss him too? I don't believe it. If anything else, I don't think he was there. And in a lot of the cases I write about, one of the other profile points is previously searched, meaning a lot of times if the victims are found, they're found in an area that had been searched, not once, not twice, sometimes 15 or 20 times. In one case, a small child was found laying across the trail that search and rescue took to go out and search a specific location every day. So no, I don't think they're missing him. I think something else is at play, but I don't know what.
Right, right. Yeah, you've always been very polite, and you make certain to mention that you're not denigrating the Park Service or anyone who's out there searching for these missing people. But I remember you telling that story before of the child laying across the path. Do you remember how long they had been searching before this child was right there where they had to walk in?
Well, it wasn't just that. A tree had fallen across the trail, and the child was laying across the tree.
That's insane.
Yeah, there's no way you're going to miss that.
No, gosh. All right. Well, one of the craziest stories in the Hunted was the story about the group of hunters at Sierra Camp. Now, you say that this is not necessarily, I guess, related to everything else, but there's like pictures, there's audio, there's video. Tell us about this, because this is mind-blowing.
So one of the knocks on our work is that we never come up with any solutions. Mm-hmm. Well, I would come up with a solution if there was one. Mm-hmm. But we've also been accused of ignoring some obvious, unusual things that happen to people in the woods. And I said, okay, well, let's do this. Let's go through and try to find something that's credible that's happened to these people, that we can substantiate it somehow. So I've probably had 100 stories come my way since I started writing about unusual things that people have encountered in the woods. And usually it's just a story. But every once in a while, something comes across that could be substantiated. So in the late 1940s, a group of hunters started to go to this one camp way up in the middle of nowhere in the Sierras. And right away, they started to have strange stuff happen to them. Sounds, things in the air, just weird stuff. And all of these people were professionals. These hunters were wealthy, some of them very wealthy, and they decided, they were smart people. And they said, you know what? This was in early 1970s. They said, let's start recording this just to prove it happened, and let's send it off to some professors we know so we can get an opinion on what it is, because we can't figure it out. So this is way before digital anything. So they had this old-time tape recorder, and they taped it. And they submitted the sounds to an audio professor for analysis. And the audio professor ran it against everything they knew that existed in North America. And they said, number one, it's not a man, because it's outside the vocal range of what we can produce as a human. And then they said, it's not any known mammal in North America. And so stop right there. If that happened today, that would be discounted, because I could tell you that through manipulation on digital audiology, that you could make anything sound like anything anywhere at any time.
Right, right.
But not in 1970.
No,
so
sir.
Because it was recorded on a hard copy audio platform in the 70s, and because an audio professor validated the unusual nature of what these guys were hearing, we said it's going in the film. Now, these guys were hunters, number one. Number two, there's been disappearances. So this happened probably within, 15 miles from the Yosemite border. Yosemite is the largest cluster of missing people in the world that we've ever profiled and documented. So based just on proximity, we said, okay, that's going in the film.
The recordings that you have included in the film are mind-blowing. You can clearly hear that there are different creatures, like making vocalizations back to these guys. And it's not just like whoops and hollers or, like ape-like. I mean, it sounds like a language at times, like sentence structure. I'd never heard anything like it.
It's very, very, very odd. Yeah. And again, before people start discounting it, pay close attention to what we put in that movie as to what substantiates all this.
Exactly.
This isn't some small or even some big hoax. This is the real deal.
I think that if anybody watches this film, with an objective eye and they bother to check the research, then there's no way that you can walk away thinking that it's, anything but, legitimate. I mean, these guys, they're not interested in fame. They're not interested in getting this story out there. They didn't even want anybody to know where the camp was, because they just want to be able to go back there and hunt with their families. So I think that it's pretty obvious. If you guys want to go ahead and check this one out, think about how big the wilderness is here in America. These national parks, they're huge areas. It's very possible that some type of animal, let's say, lives out there in unique solitude and tries to stay away. Maybe it's smart enough to stay away from human beings because it knows what's going to happen if we come across them. Now, there was one other story, the woman at the end in Ohio. This one, I realize that this is perhaps a family friend of yours, so you gave it more credence than you would have otherwise. But can you tell us about this story?
No, it's not a family friend.
Oh, okay, sorry.
It's through my work in the last 20 years.
Okay.
I happen to know a physicist that was an optical specialist, and this physicist is one of the smartest men I've ever met. And every time I had a photo that someone would send me, I would send it to him for an analysis, because he would decipher if it was a hoax, if it was good, if something was manipulated, etc. And the guy's a genius, fact. So one day I get this call from him, and he goes, "Dave," he goes, "something weird happened to my wife out here the other day when she was hunting." And he tells me this story that she sees something in the woods while she's in her hunting blind. And the best I could tell you is that you go watch the Predator movie. And when that predator is that blob in the tree, and it's moving point to point, and you can see kind of the figure in the blob, that's kind of what this was. And I should stop the audience here for a second and say, I have had probably 20 of those stories since I came out with Missing 411 Hunters, really? Told to me by hunters. This is so more common than most people think. It's something I'd never want to see, but it's something a lot of people have seen, obviously. So anyhow, this woman sees it. She has her camera out, not her camera, but her phone out, and as she's seeing this in the woods, this is the part where it gets very bizarre. About 2 air miles away, at a high school, this couple's nephew is at band practice, and they're practicing on the football field. And in the middle of practice, this bright light comes right over the top of the field. Everybody in the band stops, including the band leader, turns and looks at this thing and sees it. Band practice is done. The nephew goes home, calls his uncle right away and says, "Hey, uncle, this is what just happened on our field." Well, minutes later, the wife comes in from the blind, and eventually they have this conversation. She gives him the phone and says, "Yeah, I don't think I took a picture, but maybe I did," and blah, blah, blah. So he looks at the phone, he looks at the picture, and he says, "Oh, this is weird." He calls Verizon. He sends the picture to Verizon. And Verizon says, that picture took that phone took that picture. But based on the software and the hardware in that phone, it couldn't have taken the picture. Mm-hmm. Now, think about that closely. There was a picture taken, but the camera couldn't have legally, logistically, optically, anyways, have taken it, and they could not explain how it happened.
That's right.
And what it kind of looks like is I've seen it described, it kind of looks like a strand of DNA by way of hair. And it's kind of blurry. But Jan, the way the woman who took the picture, she always kept her hair in a kind of a bun behind her head, coming out the back of a cap while she hunted. So nobody could understand how that hair was in that picture, or even if it is hair, because we can't be sure. But it's a very odd picture. So you have the photo, you have the band practice going on, all at the same time. And because of that, and because of the time latch on the photo, we could put it all together, and that's why it was in the movie.
It's absolutely fascinating. I also thought that it was interesting that she didn't specifically remember taking a photo either. And knowing what I know about aspect ratios and pixel density, I can tell the audience that it's impossible for that phone to have taken that picture as well. It almost looked as if it was like a cropped down corner of a larger picture, but you shouldn't even be able to crop a picture like that on a BlackBerry of that age. I used to work at Verizon years ago, so I know this from firsthand fact. All right. Well, Dave, this is just absolutely an incredible subject. I'm so glad that you're doing this research and putting out these books. Do you have any additional books that you're working on currently?
I'm always working on something, but nothing specific right now. I'm more still talking about the movie and trying to get that word out and just discussing the general idea of what we're doing.
All right, great. So you've got Missing 411 and Missing 411: The Hunted. Do you have any preference where people go to watch it? I know that I purchased everything through iTunes, but I think that Missing 411 is available to watch with commercials on YouTube. Is that through your YouTube page?
So that's been pulled. That was one of 70 illegal uploads that happened.
Okay. YouTube advertised it to me the other day.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah.
But you could go to our website, just Google Can-Am, like Canadian American Missing Project,
yep,
and go to The Hunted, and you can see if you want a DVD, you can buy it. If you want to go to iTunes, Amazon, Vimeo, you can watch it online. And, and you can buy our books at the same location.
Exactly. Right. Yes, and they're only available there. Those are not available through Amazon. That's right, too, huh?
Well, if you go to Amazon, you're going to see them there, but that's not us selling them. That's resellers trying to rip you off at like $50 to $75 for a $25 book, so don't buy it there.
Yes, exactly. A lot more expensive. Huge markup on Amazon. All right, Dave. Any final thoughts you want to leave the audience with?
Hey, if you're going to go hiking in the woods, spend the best Christmas gift you could give any hiker or hunter, a personal locator beacon. Tell somebody where you're going. Always make sure you're carrying extra water, some protein bars, and last thing is know where you're going. The last thing you do when you walk out the door is check the weather where you're going, make sure it's going to be safe. Tell someone that you trust where you're going, and then text them when you come out and tell them you're safe. This could eliminate many of the missing cases that I've researched.
All right, wise words. Thank you once again, Dave Paulides, for being here, and thank you to the audience, and hope everyone has a great day. Hey guys, it's Red Pill. I just wanted to say once again, thank you very much for supporting my channel. If you want to, there are links in the description of this video below for several different ways that you can help out. Also, don't forget that when you support my sponsors, you are supporting the channel. Without them, I would not be able to keep doing the work that I'm doing. Also, if you are not already, please make sure that you are subscribed to the channel and that you click that notification bell to make sure that you get notifications every time that I do put a video out. And you can also follow me on Twitter at RedPill78. So thanks again, you guys, and I'll see you next time.